On today's episode of Product Driven, we're going to be talking about AI, which is all the hype in software engineering. If you read the headlines, we're all out of a job.
To survive and thrive, you must adopt a product-driven mindset.
And Joe here, Joe Giglio, with us today, has been testing a lot of these different tools, writing great content on his blog and LinkedIn. And I keep reading his content, and I'm like, you know what? I need Joe on the Product Driven podcast to give us his real world, view of what he's seeing. So, Joe, welcome to the show, man.
Thank you, Matt. I appreciate it. I always enjoy your content, and I appreciate you reaching out to me for this podcast.
So, how long have you been testing these tools? Like for a few months now, you've been playing around with different ones?
I think like most people, I first started to see AI code generation through Copilot. And then Cursor started to get hot, and there was a plugin called Claude Dev and Aider, and I started playing with them this past summer, and started out being kind of impressed with what it was doing, and then as the projects become more complex, it starts to go off the rails. So I figured I would go ahead and document what I was finding.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of hype, as there always is with new technology, but the reality is something different. So I started to document, is AI ready to replace all of us quite yet? And as I continue down in my journey, again, the basics work, but as the project becomes more complicated, not so fast. And it's certainly not something that somebody without any type of coding or technical background is going to be able to run with and create products. So I think we've all seen videos and articles on how it creates a snake game from a single prompt or creates a to-do list, and all that stuff works. But I wanted to approach it I have a background in help desk and ticketing software, and I wanted to start with, well, can I get one of these tools to create help desk software like a Jira or Help Scout, something like that, Zendesk. So that's where I started. I started originally using Aider and Claude Dev, which are plugins for VS Code. I'm respectable in Python, so I figured let's start with that tech stack. And it started to generate, look like some pretty good code, and it was using blueprints and some more advanced stuff with Python Flask, if you're familiar with that, which was impressive. But the server wouldn't start, and I was getting issues with circular imports and really some nasty stuff. Then the plugins were crashing. So I said, well, let's take a step back and let's start with a more basic concept. Don't ask for anything too advanced. Just start with the basics, and we'll iterate, just like a real developer would iterate. And again, it starts out okay, and would start to melt down. And I document all the oddities that I was finding. Sometimes it creates bugs that it's not able to fix. It hallucinates code. It generates code that never seems to actually get applied to your code base. A lot of issues with API limits. There's daily limits. There's
tokens, how many tokens you use, all that stuff.
Exactly, a lot of stuff like that always just slow you down.
So a friend of mine who is not a software engineer was trying to build some sort of AI app, like pretty simple application, like you described, and he knows nothing about software engineering. And he started using, I think it was Cursor, and he thought it was the coolest thing in the world. And I'm like, okay, well, let me know how it goes. And like 3 days later, it's like, you know what, man, I thought this thing was cool, but now every time I ask it to make a change, it breaks 3 more things, and I try to get it to fix those, and it can't fix those. And it's like, I quit. I'm defeated. I tried, and now he went on to go to try and do Flutterflow instead. So I guess we'll see how this works for him with Flutterflow. But I joked, I think I posted on LinkedIn about this one day. It's like the AI for people that think that they're going to do it all with AI. Might be one of the best lead generators for like people who eventually hire developers or hire development dev agencies, because it's like they want to build software, they try to do it, and then they realize, I can't really do this. Help, somebody come help me, right? And then And then you charge them twice as much. You're like, now I got to fix this crap that you created.
Well, I think that's really probably one of the ultimate promises of AI is that AI is going to replace a team of developers, and we're not there yet. And you mentioned your friend's experience, and if I didn't have some experience with development and being in the field for decades like I have been, I would have no idea how to debug it. I would have no idea how to nudge it along, nurse it along. Sometimes you have to kind of tell it what to fix and how to fix it. You're
Yeah.
not writing the code,
You got to be smarter than it.
but you're a prompt
That's the thing.
engineer and you're telling it in English what to do sometimes.
Yeah.
And that kind of works most of the time. But if you don't have any real experience debugging or, as I say, writing code from line one, you're not going to get very far other than a very basic app right now.
Well, when I played with it, I mean, when GitHub Copilot first came out, I guess maybe it's been almost like a year now. It reminded me a lot of just like autocomplete, which I've been using for like 20 years, right? Like autocomplete in Visual Studio and stuff like that is not new. It was just like a fancier version of autocomplete. And sometimes it would, create a little class file, like a model or something, and it would do it a little smarter than normal autocomplete would have done. It was pretty cool, but it saved me like 30 seconds. Like it didn't replace my job. I thought there was a lot of cool stuff like that I've seen it do. But I'm curious, where have you seen it though, where you've actually been super impressed with it? Like, have you used it to do some like refactoring using Cursor? You're like, hey, I can select this method. I can tell it to refactor it. Like, are there scenarios where it actually does a really good job?
Yeah, there's a couple of examples that I documented where I was, when I was working on the help desk system, I was looking for a drop down so I can sort the incoming tickets. I wanted to sort by subject or date. And it didn't do exactly what I wanted, but it found a jQuery library that was much more advanced, and you could click on a column to sort. It was doing it all client side, not going back to the server. Pagination was built in. So it kind of took me where I wanted to go eventually, and its suggestion was much better than I had originally asked for. So that was interesting.
Well, I still see it as a productivity tool and not something that replaces software developers. But what's interesting is when you read the headlines that come from Microsoft, from GitHub, about GitHub Copilot and Cursor and all these other places, it's a lot of hype. It's a lot of hype. And just like when you read headlines that are like super political, and you read headlines that are about any of this stuff, you always have to stop and think like, okay, who published this and why did they publish this? And what was their motivation behind it, right? And some of it, of course, is just like Microsoft is trying to sell GitHub Copilot. So they're going to publish all the case studies that just make it sound like it's really good. Like they're going to cherry pick what makes it really good. And so, I don't know, I'm always a skeptic, just like in all these things. You have to stop and think about it and be like, I don't know.
Yeah, but I think Salesforce has come out with AI bots. And there was a news release that they were hiring, I think, 1,000 new salespeople, and the stock took a nice bump because of that.
Yeah.
So, maybe there is a use for it, but I mean, I don't know if you're going to use it for support. I know just like if you pick up the phone, immediate 0 for operator. I need representative. Like customers don't like this. It might be more efficient. It might work 24/7 and doesn't need a break. So there's a place for it, but I think the customer experience is going to lag. And it usually does when you try to save money.
So you said you also tried to use this for some QA related stuff for creating playwright scripts. How did it do it at that? And I think part of the caveat with this is, can the AI actually run your code from the different ones that you've been trying, or can it only look at like, is it more just only static code analysis? It can't actually execute runtime of the code, right?
No, it cannot execute runtime of the code. What I wanted to see specifically was, and I document this, I believe, in chapter 4, was I wanted to use Playwright to create end-to-end tests for knowledge base software. And again, AI through Cursor and Claude, yes, had written all of the code for the knowledge base, which was decent, functional. Maybe not beautiful, but it worked. So I wanted to see, can I just ask this to create a bunch of end-to-end tests for me, create all the boilerplate, all the framework, and can I just run the tests and put my feet up? So, of course, the answer is no. Everything looked okay on the surface, but when you really dig in, the tests would not run immediately. They would crash for a bunch of different reasons. And then as you dig in further, I don't know how familiar you are with things like Selenium or Playwright, but you need locators. You need to be able to find certain fields, you
Yeah.
click certain buttons. And the beauty of Playwright is it's supposed to be more forgiving than Selenium if you've ever done battles with that. But what Cursor did was it would make up the names of locators. Or I had a login page, for example, /login, but I had no fields on it. So it would create a test for the login page, click on username, click on password, click submit, but those fields didn't even exist. So okay, it makes a lot of assumptions, it makes hallucinations, and again, you have to really be very familiar with your code and the capabilities of Playwright in order to get the most out of it. I was not able to, at least in the current iteration, to say, look at the product and give me top 10 tests, generate them. I want to add them to my CI pipeline, for example. Not so easy. Sometimes it would return a good list of tests by name. Other times it would kind of go off the deep end. And again, this is simple code that Claude itself generated. So I'd be very curious to know if somebody took this and pointed it towards a more complex code base that's been around for several years and different coding styles and had different people touching it. How difficult is that? This was very difficult with code that Claude itself had written. So really couldn't get that far off the ground again without really digging in and driving it and knowing what to ask it.
Well, wouldn't it make a big difference if the full model of this and like full runtime of this was on your machine and it could actually like run the code? Wouldn't that make a big difference in what it could do?
It would, but I can't even get that far because it won't run. It won't run without me manually cleaning it up is what I'm trying to explain. Like it generates framework and it looks good on the surface. It's clicking elements and it's asserting, it's doing expects, all that good stuff, but it's making up locators and things that just don't work. So it would be nice if it
So
ran. It has to pass first.
But when it did that for you, so it was already running your code in the browser and then like during runtime of that figuring out what the Playwright script should be, or was it just looking only at the raw source code?
It would look at the source code,
Okay.
generate a file full of tests that it thought would be correct,
Okay.
and then you try to run it and see, oh, it tried, but it made up elements or didn't understand. Like if there's a div that's hidden, you have to if you have like a bootstrap modal, for example, and it's hidden, it didn't understand that it wasn't visible at the moment. Like a lot of stuff like that, and you kind of have to nurse it along.
Well, I could see in a future though where honestly we might all have to have supercomputers to run this stuff where we're running like a full-blown like LLM on our local machines. Like we might need a GPU and everything, right? And especially if you have a code base with like hundreds of thousands of lines of code, millions of lines of code. And then this would be a lot more powerful, right? Because then you could really run a lot of this on your local machine and process an entire code base through the RAG. I mean, RAG right now has a limitation of, a certain number of megabytes or whatever. You can only put so much data into it. But over time, obviously, all this is going to change. But I could see in the future where it's like we're going to have like our own little workstation supercomputer just to run this stuff.
Yep, absolutely. I agree. Yeah. And I know it's only as good as you feed it, obviously. So with Playwright being fairly new and Selenium being around forever, the chapter I'm working on now is, well, what if I try Selenium instead? Fortunately, not much better. A lot of the same problems. So maybe I'm not prompting it correctly. That's possible. I'm certainly not a professional prompt engineer, but again, looking at it through the eyes of maybe somebody who is not that technical or an engineer that, nobody likes to write these tests. That's been a constant battle in my career.
Right.
So, maybe an engineer can open this up and say, create my top 10 use cases by looking at the code, I want to add it to my CI as a smoke test before we release each build. And, not even that really works without a lot of nudging.
But that still brings up the common problem of software development that we talk a lot about on Product Driven, that everything needs to be thought about at a higher level. Like, what are we doing? Why are we doing this? From a product perspective, a user perspective. And just to ask the LLM, like, hey, build my top 10 tests, it's like, it may not build the top 10 tests that matter at all, right? Like, you should be picking the tests that matter to the user in the product. Like, you have to have the higher level thinking of like, why are we doing this? What are we trying to test? Because it may suggest all the wrong things, because if it doesn't understand why people use this either.
Exactly. And AI does not have any of that context at all. So again, you are not replacing all of the humans. And
We're going to build tests on all the deprecated code. Let's go.
you could say I document as I try to nudge this along. Each time I asked for a top 10 list of tests, sometimes it was much better than others. Other times it would focus on just search, for example, giving me a dozen tests on search. So again, you have to really drive it, and you have to ask exactly what you want.
Well, I'm glad you say it that way, because all along I felt like programming code is basically English anyways, right? It's English. We're not writing in assembler. We're writing in English. And really complicated software would have even more complicated requirements, right? Like the requirements would have to be uber complicated. So you talk about prompt engineering, you'd have to write super complicated, detailed prompts to get like real world application that has any kind of business logic and stuff in it. And to some degree, that's when I ask, like, at what point is it easier to write the code than to write the prompt?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And they both end up looking like Python code anyways. They both look like English.
Yep.
What is the difference?
Yeah. Yep. Oh, one of the other issues that I had that I just wanted to mention was this was when I had moved over to Cursor. Trying to explain this. Have you used Cursor's? It's called a composer window. Are you familiar with that?
I haven't played with it, no.
Okay. Well, you hit the magical key combination of Command Shift I, and that opens up a new window on top of your regular coding window. And that's when you could ask it in plain English what to build. And again, usually it works, but I was having some strange issue one night where I needed a change to CSS, and it would show me the code was being written, code was being changed. You would accept it and then go back to the main window, and this code didn't exist. Like, it was telling you it was making code changes, but it wasn't. And I went round and round with this, and there's a debug console inside of Cursor, and I could see it was spewing out all these errors about directories that didn't exist, files that didn't exist. It was basically generating code in dummy files or generating code in files that Flask did not know how to read. So it kind of lost context of where the files should go. So there's a feature within Cursor that you can go and reindex your files. It seemed like maybe the file somehow got corrupted. I guess it happens, so you could reindex it.
Yeah.
That didn't work. So I posted that to the Cursor forums. I thought I was going crazy. Like,
you didn't ask AI how to fix it?
Well, I even said it when I documented, I could really use AI about now. But I asked in the help forums, what's going on? Am I going crazy? And this turned out to be a real bug. It took them, I think, 23 days to fix.
Okay.
So something went wrong again, where the project becomes too complicated at some point, and it kind of goes off the rails. So they did fix that. That's the good news. The bad news, though, is if you spend enough time on these Cursor and Claude forums, it's several layers of black box. There's queuing systems. There's constant code updates in the background. I believe it's proxying your requests over to Claude. I don't know how it works in the black box, but things that worked on your last request might not work now. The queuing system could reach capacity, and things break down. So, what used to work yesterday might not work today, and you kind of think you're going crazy, and you're running in
We're on
circles.
the bleeding edge here.
It's all bleeding edge, and everyone's updating code, and
Mostly bleeding.
Yeah, you don't update your client yet, things are changing, and you kind of question your sanity sometimes with this stuff too, because everyone is trying to move so fast.
Danger about being on the bleeding edge is you don't want to bleed out.
Right.
Well, I really appreciate having you on here and talking about this today. And I think there's no doubt that we'll continue to see a lot of innovation in this. And over time, it'll help us all be more productive. But the thing that the non-software engineers don't understand, that just read all the marketing hype versus what us real software engineers know, we don't spend most of our time writing code. We spend most of our time reading code, reading requirements, debugging, troubleshooting, going to meetings, all these other things. Like literally 80% of our day is all this other crap. A lot of us like yearn to have like an hour to sit down and actually write code and uninterrupted. Like that would be a magical experience. And I'll never forget, several years ago, I saw some study that claimed the average software developer wrote like 6 lines of code a day, which blew my mind. I'm like, how in the world is it 6 lines of code? But after doing this for a long time, like now I understand. I'm like, okay, because I only get to do that for like an hour a day.
Yeah.
And the biggest impacts of AI would be a lot of this other parts of the job, actually. But if it can make us, let's say it's 50% more productive, we write 9 lines of code now instead of 6, like that would be great. But I think realistically, it's a productivity booster, and I think it can help a lot of us. Now, granted, if you had 1,000 software developers, now you know, over 1,000, yeah, maybe it'll save that you need a few less. But if you only have a team of 5, like it's not probably going to make that big of a difference.
Yeah. And just to add to that, I think a lot of professional software developers, they make surgical changes to long forgotten code that people are scared to touch. Maybe it's been the foundation of the product for years. The original developers are long gone. So you change the code.
That's what we need AI for. Wait a second, you just found it.
Exactly. So you change
AI is going to fix that, so I don't get the blame for breaking that shit.
Well, that's kind of where I'm going with that. I mean, you change the code, you cross your fingers, you hope you don't break anything. But if AI is able to do that, then it's worth its money. But I couldn't even get it to fix its own stupid Python Flask code. So, you know, I'd like to see, maybe somebody has documented this. Yeah, how does this work with an existing complicated code base where, again, you have to make surgical changes and everybody's scared to touch it. Nobody knows what it does. It just works. I'd love to see a test on that.
Yeah, and it's going to have to be able to run the code and control the inputs and the outputs to verify like if it works and stuff. Static code analysis only takes you so far because most real world apps use databases and APIs, all these things that are dynamic at runtime. So you can't test all this.
And then microservices that need to speak to each other, and you know that it's not one Python file. It's very complicated code in different languages, and stuff way beyond me.
And then something is null that's never supposed to be null, and the whole damn thing breaks. It's like what we do every day.
Yep.
Well, Joe, I really appreciate having you on Product Driven today. Big fan of your LinkedIn post up, kind of your biography of your AI challenges are fun, so maybe people can follow along. If people want to learn more about you, Joe, how can they reach out to you?
They could go to my site, joegiglio.org, that has links to my email, Twitter, and LinkedIn right on that.
All right. Well, thank you again for being on the show. We'll see you guys on the next episode of Product Driven.
Thanks, Matt.